Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something a little different. Not the Viking gods, not the berserkers, not the war axes and shield walls, but memory. Specifically, how we remember the Vikings, and why that matters. This episode is inspired by a fascinating article by Caitlin Ellis titled Remembering the Vikings, Ancestry, Cultural Memory, and Geographical Variation. And I'll be honest with you, this one hits deep, because it's not just about Viking history. It's about who gets to shape it, who tells the story, what gets passed down and what gets left behind. And that applies not just to ancient warriors, but to all of us. Let's start by rewinding to the Viking Age, roughly the 8th to the 11th centuries. During this time, Norsemen from modern-day Norway, Denmark, and Sweden set out across the known world. Some came as raiders, others came as traders, settlers, explorers. They didn't just hit the British Isles, they made it to Russia, the Mediterranean, even North America. These weren't one-dimensional brutes. They were complex, mobile, adaptable people. But here's the catch. Most of what we know about them, it wasn't written down by them. The sagas, the histories, the chronicles, they were all recorded after the Viking Age was over, sometimes centuries later. That's what Caitlin Ellis points out right away. The Viking legacy is built not just on what happened, but on how people remembered it later. And that's where this idea of cultural memory comes in. Cultural memory isn't just a record of the past. It's the story a culture chooses to keep alive. It's the version of events passed down from generation to generation, reshaped along the way to serve the needs of the moment. Take Iceland, for example. The people who settled Iceland were Norwegians fleeing kings, tyranny, or just seeking independence. The sagas celebrate that. They turn these settlers into founders of a free, noble land. And centuries later, those same stories were used to reinforce Icelandic national pride, especially when they were trying to break away from Danish rule. Those sagas didn't just survive, they were revived for a reason. They were used to build identity. And it's not just Iceland. In Orkney and Shetland, way up north in Scotland, you've got descendants of Viking settlers who still take pride in their Norse ancestry. The Orkneyinga saga doesn't just tell stories. It legitimizes the rule of Norse earls by linking them to the gods and heroic lineages. That wasn't just history. It was propaganda, identity building in action. And this is the part that really gets me thinking. Because if Viking memory has always been selective, if it's always been shaped by people centuries after the fact, then what does that say about the image we have now? Think about it. There are regions in Europe that don't celebrate their Viking past, even though the archaeology says the Vikings were there. Places like Wales or parts of the Netherlands, there's clear Viking activity, but the stories didn't survive or weren't kept alive. So we forget. They fade. That's not an accident. That's how memory works. It's not just about truth, it's about what gets retold. Ellis even brings up this wild example, a Norwegian prince named Magnus Haraldsson. His exploits show up in Irish and English sources, but not in the Scandinavian ones. So he gets forgotten in Norway. That right there is cultural memory at work. The absence of remembrance is just as powerful as remembrance itself. And then there's the Victorian era. Man, those guys loved the Vikings. In the 1800s, there was this full-blown Viking revival. Not because people were suddenly discovering new history, but because writers and nationalists were cherry-picking the Viking image they wanted. Romanticized warriors, stoic seafarers, noble savages. That image spread through art, literature, and eventually Hollywood. And today, it's that version that's on your t-shirt, your sports team logo, or your History Channel special. It's branding. The Viking brand has become this global icon, fierce, adventurous, masculine, untamed. But that brand was built on layers and layers of selective memory. Now here's where my own perspective kicks in. I don't think that's inherently bad. Storytelling is part of who we are. Myth, identity, ritual, it all gets wrapped up in how we pass things down. But I do think it's dangerous when we stop asking questions. When we take the Viking image as gospel and forget how much has been lost, rewritten or reshaped to fit someone else's agenda. That's why I do these episodes, because beneath the horned helmet stereotypes and tourist souvenirs, there's a real legacy. A legacy of movement, of interaction, of people carving out new homes and new identities across a chaotic, changing world. And now, thanks to modern tech like DNA analysis and archaeology, we're rediscovering that complexity. We're seeing that Viking societies weren't homogeneous. They were mixed, diverse, fluid. And that challenges the old, pure bloodline myths that some groups love to push. The real Viking legacy? It's messier, but it's also richer. And of course, like Ellis points out, modern politics plays a role too. In Russia, there was a huge debate over whether the Rus's people were of Scandinavian origin or Slavic. The so-called Normanist versus anti-Normanist controversy. Why? Because national identity was on the line. And Viking history became part of the political battleground. Same in Scandinavia, same in Britain, same everywhere, really. History gets rewritten depending on who needs to use it, which is why it's so important that we don't just consume the myths. We dig into the bones beneath them, the archaeology, the lost names, the regions that weren't remembered, the voices that got left out of the sagas. Those pieces matter. So what's the takeaway here? Viking memory isn't fixed. It's a living, evolving story. And it's been shaped by poets, monks, kings, rebels, politicians, and now even YouTubers. We inherit pieces of the past, but it's up to us to decide how we use them. Me? I say honor the complexity. Don't settle for the one-note berserker or the horned helmet. Look deeper. Respect the people who didn't make it into the sagas. And remember that the real Viking spirit wasn't about brute force. It was about movement, survival, identity, and legacy. And that legacy? It's still unfolding. This narration was based on Caitlin Ellis's article, Remembering the Vikings, Ancestry, Cultural Memory, and Geographical Variation. I highly recommend checking it out if you want to go even deeper. Until next time, this is the Warrior Shaman, honoring the past, questioning the myths, and walking that line between memory and meaning.